DJI Mavic Pro, and I've been using it for about 6 or 7 months now. And if you've seen my previous videos on the drone, you'll know that before January I'd never flown a drone before, so I'm a complete newcomer. And also I'd only just started using video. So this review, it's not going to be remotely technical, and neither is it going to be an in-depth comparison because I don't have anything to compare it to. But what I'm going to talk about is how good the drone is and how effective it is at getting the kind of footage that I want from it, which is principally landscape and travel video and still photography, and how easy the drone is to fit into my everyday shooting kit when I'm traveling. Now, if you saw the first video that I made about the drone back in January, you'll know that my first experience of flying it made me a little bit nervous. What I didn't expect was how challenging it would be psychologically. I sort of felt quite a strong sense of vertigo. I kept thinking it was going to fall out of the sky, fly off over the horizon, and I kept thinking I was going to crash it, basically. Now, from the comments that I got on that video and from emails that I got from my website, it became pretty apparent that that fear of flying, that sort of sense of vertigo, was something that resonated with a lot of people who were using drones or flying drones for the first time. And with me, it continued for quite a few months. I think it's natural. It's not going to go away straight away. You're learning something new. You're putting a financial investment at risk. You think it's going to fall out of the sky, you're going to crash it, it's going to fly over the horizon. So it's something that takes some getting used to. And in my own experience, it lasted for quite a long while. Each time I found with each flight, sort of pushing myself a little bit further, going a little bit higher, and eventually it goes away. You just basically learn to develop a sort of trust in the software, a trust in the equipment that it's going to function, and you also learn to develop a trust in yourself and your own capacity to operate the equipment. And what you find is that the best footage, the kind of shots that you really want, will always involve you pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, flying it further away than you ever have done before, going out of your eye line, flying in sort of windier conditions than you're totally comfortable with, going a little bit higher. Because the only way that you can guarantee that nothing's going to go wrong is to not fly at all. And what you find is that the best footage comes when you're willing to take a little bit of risk and when you're willing to push yourself. And that's when you get the kind of film and the kind of video. That's the reason why you buy the drone in the first place. But that's just general experience about flying drones. What about the Mavic in particular for meeting the kind of needs that I had? Now, I've been interested in drones for quite a long while, but I was always put off by them because they're so big and bulky. And I'm a photographer, and generally whenever I'm going traveling, whenever I'm going anywhere, I've usually got a couple of cameras in my bag, I've got a tripod, I've got a couple of lenses, same when I go traveling. So when I looked at drones like the Phantom 4 or the Inspire, things like that, they looked great and I really wanted to use them, but I could just never imagine that I was going to be able to take that as well as my photography gear at the same time. So when DJI announced the Mavic, I was naturally interested and I got hold of it. Now, since I've had the Mavic, I've been away quite a few times. I went for a couple of days in Tuscany, I went hiking across Iceland in the Highlands with pretty much everything on my back. I've done quite a number of hikes on the west coast of Portugal, up and down cliffs and things like that. And what I found with the Mavic it is excellent at fitting alongside my regular photography kit without taking up any excess weight, because it weighs a little bit more than a kilogram, or without fitting any particular excess bulk. It's not big or an inconvenient thing to carry. Likewise, when I'm traveling, it fits really easily into my carry-on gear that I take onto the plane with me. This is an f-stop small ICU Pro, and it's what I use to carry all my camera equipment. You can see my cameras in there and a couple of lenses, along with the Mavic, a couple of batteries, and the controller, which is kind of stored in a compartment underneath the actual drone. Everything fits in there really well, and I don't feel any need to carry a bigger bag. It's great, it's so portable. So in those terms, the Mavic does everything that I hoped. It's easy to carry, and I don't feel any inconvenience taking it with me wherever I want to go. It's also really tough. Now, it's not classed as being weatherproof, but I've flown it in a little bit of rain, I've flown it in high wind, and I've flown it in sea spray. I kind of had a few accidents with it. In Tuscany, I sort of crashed it into a field of wet corn and the drone got very wet. But it always picked it up and it always starts working well. You just dust it down, get the water off it, and it is really quite resilient for such a little thing. most important things for me is the usability of the drone, and that is how easy it is to get it up in the air and to get flying and shooting video footage and still photography. Because principally my prime reason whenever I'm on location is to take photos with my regular camera. So when I arrive, I'm going to be setting my tripod, setting up my camera, and what I want is that the drone can fit seamlessly into that process, so I can get it up, fly across, take some footage and stuff like that without it getting in the way of my regular photography. Now, in the time that I've been using the Mavic, I've found that it's excellent at that. As I say, I've taken it to Tuscany, I've taken it to Iceland and shot both things side by side. What I've found is that generally from getting the Mavic out of my bag, unfolding the legs, turning it on, turning the remote control on, connecting, calibrating, is going to take about 1.5 to 2 minutes. And then what I can quickly do is get the drone up, fly it to wherever I want to go and get some really nice footage before coming back and carrying on with my other thing, which is shooting still photographs. So the final thing, and probably the most important thing, is the image quality. Is the video quality and is the photo quality good enough to get the kind of images and the kind of video that I really want? Well, the answer is yeah, pretty much. But it needs work. It's not great right out of the box. Now, if you've seen my other video, the video that I made on the settings for the Mavic, since then I've kind of refined and changed a lot of my approach in order to try to get the absolute best out of the camera that I can. So the first thing that I've done is that I no longer shoot at 4K. I now shoot at 2.7K and at 25 frames per second. Now, the reason for this is to do with bit rate, and that's the speed with which the image data is moved from the camera and onto the card. Now, if you shoot at 4K, the bit rate is 60 megabytes per second, but if you shoot at 2.7K, the bit rate is a little bit less, at 45 megabytes per second. But it's actually faster because 2.7K has less resolution. It's actually faster per pixel, so it's getting that information quicker onto the card. And if you set the frame rate at 25 frames per second, you're giving the camera the best opportunity to get the highest quality of image transfer you can. Now, one of the things I noticed when I first started using the Mavic was in certain kind of shots, particularly panning shots where I lifted the camera up from pointing vertically down to pointing straight ahead, that I start to get a kind of noise or some kind of interference in parts of the picture. You can see it here. And I couldn't work out what it was that was doing that. And what I found is since I started using 2.7K instead of 4K and 25 frames per second, now when I'm doing those kind of shots, I don't have to worry about that nasty noise quite so much. Now, another aspect of the settings is the actual settings of the image quality of the camera. Now, I already made a video about the settings that I use, but since I did that, I've actually changed my approach a little bit. Most of this comes down to the guy over at Film Poets, and I'll put the link above or in the description below, who's done some incredible work in getting the absolute best out of the Mavic camera in terms of the sharpening settings particularly, and noise reduction. Now again, go and look at his videos. He really is a guy who really seems to understand exactly what it is about the Mavic camera and how to get the best out of it. Now, the most important thing about that is the sharpening setting, is that if you have the sharpening setting on 0 or lower, -1, -2, -3, then the DJI software starts to implement noise reduction, which gives you a kind of smeary look, which is particularly noticeable in the shadows where you start to lose detail. So you need to put the sharpening setting at +1, and then you can put the saturation at 0 or lower, or the contrast at 0 or lower. I currently have the contrast on on -2. But the most important thing is to have the sharpening on +1, because what that will do is make sure that you don't get the smeary look in the shadows, and it'll get out the absolute maximum detail that you can from the image file. However, the downside of that is that in certain parts of the image, particularly in shadows, in high contrast scenes, you'll start to notice that you're getting noise. You can see it here in the shadows, in the fields. So what you're going to need to do is to apply noise reduction. Now again, over at Film Poets, he's got together with Neat Video to produce these presets which work particularly well with the Mavic camera and with the specific settings that we're talking about. And you apply them onto an adjustment layer, and that really enables you to get rid of the noise that you've created by having the sharpening set at +1. So for me, this gives me the best image quality that I can get from the camera. And since I've been using those settings, I've been much happier with the kind of image quality that I'm getting in videos, particularly when I'm shooting in high contrast scenes like sunrise or sunset in the shadow areas. Now another thing that I found helps with image quality is neutral density filters. So these are the set that I'm using. They are made by Polar Pro, but you can get all kinds of brands. I asked on my last video what people recommended, and these seems to be the ones that most people recommend. Now they fit really easily onto the front of the camera. You just need to make sure that you put them on before you turn the drone on. You don't want to turn it on, go through gimbal calibration and then try to push them on. Always do it while the drone is turned off. It's much easier that way. It's much better for the camera. Now what neutral density filters do is they cut down the amount of light that's coming into the camera, which allows you to use a slower shutter speed, and this gives you less flicker. Now I'm no video expert, so I don't really know exactly what I'm talking about, but my assumption is that if you're shooting 25 frames per second and you're shooting at a shutter speed of 1 in 1000, that means for most of that second, your shutter speed is so fast that there's a lot of period within that second when you're not actually shooting and the camera is actually open. So by using a slower shutter speed, you'll get a tiny little bit of movement blur, but at 25 frames per second, it's really not noticeable. And what it does mean that for each one of those seconds, the camera is actually recording, which gives you a much smoother footage and makes it look less jittery and feel a lot more cinematic. I could be wrong about the actual reasons behind that. I'm really not sure. I've not really looked into it, but the results are certainly there. And the basic rule is you always want to be shooting at kind of double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you want to have a shutter speed of about 1/50th. So you put on a neutral density filter, and they have different thicknesses to try to get it as close to that as possible and give you much smoother, more cinematic footage. So that's video. What about still photography? Now I've actually been really quite impressed with the quality of the raw files on the Mavic. The JPEG, it's nasty, it's got all kinds of noise reduction, things going on, forget it. Don't shoot JPEG with the Mavic. Shoot in RAW and then use a RAW converter like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom or something like that to get the absolute best quality that you can out of the files. I've been really quite impressed. Now, as long as you're not shooting in particularly really low light, so sort of an hour after the sun's gone down when you're past the blue hour, you can actually get some really high detail, good looking files that you're certainly capable of printing up to about 40 centimeters wide. So you can see a few examples here. These were done with the Mavic when I was shooting in Iceland, and they are basically pointing straight down at riverbeds or glaciers and things like that, where I was trying to create some sort of abstract composition. So one of the things about such a small camera is that the pixels on the sensor are much smaller. So what that has the effect of is reducing the dynamic range, and the dynamic range is the range between the highlights, the brightest part of the image, and the shadows, the darkest part of the image. And what that means, if you're shooting really high contrast scenes, the shadows are going to go to black and there'll be no detail there, or worse, the highlights will go to bright white and blow out and look all burnt and there's no detail there. So the best way to do with this on the Mavic is to shoot the auto exposure bracket, which gives you an image that's shot at the base exposure, which is the exposure that you shot manually, because you should always be setting your exposure manually. But it also gives you a shot that's underexposed by 1 stop and a shot that's overexposed by 1 stop, which gives you a much wider dynamic range, by about 2 stops wider. So what you can then do is select those 3 images and merge them together in Lightroom. Now for me, as someone who's never flown a drone before, one of the most complex features, one of the things that I found the most difficult to get my head around, was the huge number of software features that comes with it. So I'm talking about things like the active tracking and all that kind of stuff. So there's the getting used to it, understanding what it all does, and then there's the learning to have trust in it and seeing how it works and incorporating it into what you're doing. So the first thing to talk about really is the return to home feature, which I think is possibly the one that most people will come into contact with first. Now generally I don't use it. I actually like to fly the drone as manually as possible, bring it into land as much as I can. But on the couple of occasions when I have used it, it's always been incredibly accurate. It brings it into literally within a few meters within a few centimeters of where I took off. You can set, there's a feature within the software, within the DJI 4 app, that you can set where you can change the height. So when it returns to home, it rises to a particular altitude. I think the default is 30 meters. I've raised it to about 50 meters just to make sure that there's a little bit extra clearance. Now on one occasion when I was in Iceland, I sort of flew the drone around behind kind of a mountain and completely lost signal. And it was semi-darkness, so I couldn't really see the drone very well, and in that particular occasion the return to home feature was excellent. So I could see that I lost contact, and I received a message saying that the drone was going to return to home. Pretty soon it kind of lifted up over the horizon and came back towards me, and things like that work very well, and it gives you a lot of trust in the functioning of the software. Now DJI have been making drones for a long time, so they've had a lot of time to refine and get their software really robust and quite resilient, so there's not a lot that I think goes wrong with it, certainly not in my experience. Now the Mavic has a forward-facing sensor and any downward facing sensor. And in my experience, it works very well. It stops me from flying forwards into stuff. But of course, I spend a lot of time flying sideways, flying backwards, doing reveal shots. And one of the things that I would love on the Mavic, certainly on the next generation, is the thing that the Phantom 4 Pro's got, is sideways facing sensors, but in particular rearward facing sensors, because I do spend a lot of time flying the drone backwards, because I think it's a much more interesting angle. And there are just some cases, particularly if you're flying over the ocean, when you can't fly forwards and invert the footage, you actually have to physically fly backwards. And when the drone is a long way away and you can't see it very well and you've got limited depth perception, it's sometimes quite hard to judge how high you are or how far away you are from objects. So rearward facing sensors would be great. The forward facing sensor one works extremely well, but I'd probably in the next generation that would be something that I would really, really like. Now, in addition to that, the Mavic has a whole host of additional features, things like the active track and stuff like that. Now, there is a load of these. There are so many that I actually haven't used them all. I look at some of them, I know what they do, but I basically can't find a need for them. I can't find any use for them in the kind of footage that I want to shoot, although I'm sure some people have things that they really, really like. Now, in my case, one of the features that I do use a lot and I think is extremely good is the tripod mode. Now, what this does is it slows the drone down and it makes the input in the controllers very, very slow. So if you push the controller hard over to the right or hard over to the left, it slowly starts to move in the direction that you're pushing the stick, which gives you an incredible amount of control. Now, this is really good if you're flying it in very confined spaces. Like, for example, when I was shooting in these trees here, the capacity that you've got to maneuver around the trees, you know that the movements that you're inputting into the controller aren't going to make the drone jerk around a lot. So it really gives you an incredible amount of control. Another one of the features on the Mavic is the active track mode. Now, how this works is that you can select an object, you draw like a green circle around it, and then the Mavic can actually track that or follow that subject. Now, in my own experience, it works quite well. You can identify a person, you can identify a car and follow a car, but you have to be relatively close. I found myself quite often when I'm quite a long way away wanting to do really long tracking shots. And unfortunately, the Mavic just gives me a message saying that it's too far away for it to track that subject. So you have to be, I found, within something like about 10 meters of the subject, which is really quite close. So it doesn't work very well if you've got the drone a long way away, you want to lock on and then bring the drone in closer and closer and closer to your subject, because you can't lock on when you're that far away. Now, the active track has three different varieties. There's the trace, there's the profile, and there's the spotlight. Now, the one that I tend to use the most is trace, where the Mavic will keep the subject centered and follow them wherever they go. And what it also means is if you use the left and right, the yaw sticks, you kind of circle around the subject, which means you can get these lovely circular movements as the subject's walking, because the Mavic will compensate and keep a fixed distance, which means they can't walk out of shot as the Mavic does a big circle around them, which looks really great when you're filming it. Now, things like tap fly or terrain follow, I've not found a need for them yet, so I've not put them to the test. Now, there's loads of information on the web, so if those are features that you found particularly interesting or something that you really think that you're going to need, then I would urge you to Google it, because there'll be someone there who knows a lot more about it than I do. One thing that's really impressed me is the gimbal stabilization on the Mavic. Now, I live in Portugal and I shoot a lot on the west coast where it gets very windy, and I also took the drone to Iceland where again we got a lot of wind, and there were quite a few times when I was flying when I was getting warnings telling me that the velocity of the wind was too high and that I should bring the drone into land. But basically, the footage that I filmed there didn't look like it was windy at all, because first of all, the Mavic is extremely good at compensating against the wind, and then beyond that, the gimbal works incredibly well at keeping the footage, keeping the camera steady. So even if you can see that it's very windy and it's blowing the Mavic around a little bit and the Mavic's having to compensate against the wind, the footage that you get due to the camera stabilization is going to be rock steady. It's something that I didn't expect at all from such a small drone, and it is very impressive. Now, as I said, a lot of time when I'm using the drone, it's when I'm out hiking, and it's not necessarily easy to find a place to take off and land. Now, unlike the Phantom, which has these kind of lovely landing rails, the Mavic is very flat to the ground. The clearance between the gimbal and the ground is incredibly low. Now, you can get landing gear, which helps a little bit, and I've got those and I talked about them in a previous video, and they are good. They do give it like about that much extra clearance and help make it easier to take off. And generally, it is easy to find some way that you can take it off, even if it's at an angle or something like that. As long as the propellers aren't hitting the ground, you're going to be able to get it in the air. But landing is much more complex. It's much harder to find. If you've got a tiny landing ground, it's much harder to land it precisely. So one of the things that I learned to do, and I think is a really good skill for anyone who's got the Mavic, is the hand catch. So basically, it's catching it out of the air when it lands. Now, the easiest way to do this is to fly until it's about 2.5 meters above the ground, so you can reach up and catch it. Keep your hands underneath it, making sure you don't touch your propellers. Now, what's going to happen is as soon as you get hold of it, the downward facing sensor is going to sense you and it's going to try to pull away, so you'll hear the propellers powering up. So you have to cling on and then just slowly power down with the left stick, pulling it down, pulling it towards you. And after a few seconds, the Mavic powers down, the propeller stops spinning, and you've landed. Now, learning how to hand catch means you can pretty much launch and fly the drone from anywhere, from boats, from incredibly rocky places, and you don't have to worry because you're always going to be able to get it down safely. Now, another technique that I think is really useful to become familiar with it is flying the drone while you're inside a car. So you can basically do tracking shots while you're driving, and it saves you from having to stand outside the drone, follow the car, and the car comes around and back. Last month in Iceland, we spent a lot of time driving over the Highlands in a Jeep, and we really wanted to capture some dramatic footage of the Jeep driving across the desert plains there. So sitting in the back of the Jeep, it is quite tricky because obviously there's a roof there, so you can't see the drone physically. You're dependent entirely on what you can see on the screen, and of course while you're concentrating on the screen, you can't see where the Jeep's going. Obviously, I was a passenger, but the Jeep's going to be making movements which you can't anticipate. So basically it's an extra level of control, learning how to do these shots while you're inside a moving vehicle. Now, tracking does look nice, but all that's going to be able to do is to follow you or to keep the vehicle in view all the time. If you want to be doing these kind of diagonal passing shots, tracking doesn't tend to work as well for that. There's a degree of anticipation, sort of predicting where the drone and the vehicle that you're in is going to cross. But it's a lot of fun, something that I spent a lot of time playing around with and had a lot of fun doing. So I think that's it. I think I've pretty much covered everything in the 6 or 7 months since I've been using it. That's most of the experience that I've had and what I've discovered. And really, what I can say is this little thing is a fantastic drone. Now, it's not the best drone on the market. The Phantom 4 Pro will give you much better image quality. The Inspire will give you much better image quality. But what you have to think about is the compromise that you're making. Now, a lot of the time when I go traveling, I want to travel as light as possible. And the simple fact is that if I'd had a Phantom 4 Pro or an Inspire, while those drones would have given me much better image quality, the reality is I probably wouldn't have had them with me in the first place. When I was in Iceland, I was camping, we spent a lot of time backpacking, and there was just no way that I'd been able to carry all of my equipment plus the Phantom 4 Pro with me as well. But the Mavic, it's so small, it's so light, it takes up no space, so it's easy to have it with me. Next month I'm going to be hiking in the mountains in the Dolomites, and again, it's easy to take the Mavic with me, but there's no way that I'd be taking a bigger drone with me. So if image quality is your absolute main priority, then the fact is that you should buy something like a Phantom 4 Pro. It's going to give you better image quality, particularly if you're going to be shooting at places that are relatively easy to access, or you're not carrying other equipment as I do, because I've usually got camera equipment with me. In that case, then this is probably not the best drone that you can get. But if you spend a lot of time off the beaten track, if you travel a lot and want something really small that you're not going to notice in your bag, if you spend a lot of time hiking, or if you're like me, you take a lot of other equipment with you when you go, then this really is a superb thing and will get you excellent footage, and you'll be really glad that you've got it with you. I know I can't speak for everyone, but for me, this has been such an amazing thing. It's been revolutionary. It's kind of given me such a different perspective on the way that I take pictures, on the way that I travel, and give me a capacity to kind of shoot the kind of footage that I never imagined that I'll be able to get, and I'm really glad I bought it. So I hope that's been useful. I hope that's told you everything that you need to know about this little thing. If there's anything that you're not sure about, drop me a comment or send me an email from our website. And as ever, once again, thanks for watching and take care.